you.
That's how you do it?
Warhammer is a series nearly over 40 years old and rife with dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of misconceptions about the series, along with a few hundred stories, myths, and fun facts that are purposefully vague, embellished, and left up to your imagination so that anyone, anywhere, can make an army of plastic soldiers that look or act in any way and still have them canon to the universe. While Warhammer does have specific timelines and has cleaned its lore up as it goes, I think a lot of people forget that at the end of the day, among all the books, games, and whatever else, the core of the series is the plastic soldiers. How you build, paint, and field them on the tabletop is important, and the universe at large is there to get you invested in them. Think of Transformers, but in classic Warhammer fashion, this is turned up to 11. And with so many lore channels, memes, and communities that all come to Warhammer in different ways, there's no single view of what Warhammer even is. What my interpretation of the hobby is could be entirely different from yours. I like to collect and paint the minis. I like the video games. I like the stories, and a deep part of me likes to see how they stack up against other universes and the metaphysics and philosophies at play. I get nerdy like that. Some people only read the books, or only paint and never touch the board game. Hell, there's some people out there who probably still think Space Marine is an offshoot of Gears of War. All that to say, Warhammer is big and expansive. Now, you may have noticed the title of this video is 5 Big Misconceptions People Have About Warhammer, or something along those lines. But the tricky thing here is, the term misconception does a lot of the lifting, because certain facts of the Warhammer universe are entirely interpretive, which leads to a lot of fan theories and common headcanons to become kind of canon in the eyes of the community, which we will get into. Before we go any further, I do want to take a minute to salute and thank all my beautiful ladies and animals who support the channel, all my members who you can join for just $1 a month, and everyone else who subscribes or leaves behind a comment to support the channel. For today, I am not in charge of absolutes. My main goal is to point out 5 common misconceptions I see most often in the comments of my own Warhammer videos, and point out if they're wrong, and if so, how. So strap in, get your comment ready for some hot takes, and let's just jump right into it. Now, this first one is likely the most common you'll find on the internet, and especially in the kinds of videos I make. Hell, just today, as I was writing this script, I saw a comment on my video about Phildrum in 40k that reads, "The orcs will think they are puny, weak humans and obliterate them because of their belief powers." Now, whether the commenters who repeat this genuinely believe it, because Warhammer always wins, or they're making a jab or a joke, I can't say 100% across the board, but the actual truth of this is a lot less fun. As much as we all might, myself included, probably love the concepts of orc color theory and their powers of belief, it's not as all-powerful or all-encompassing as it's commonly portrayed. Whether it's a mix of the memes or just lazy research, which I've fallen prey to if you look back at some of my older videos, but this myth just sort of persists, and in that way it's looped around to being kind of accepted widely by the broader Warhammer communities as a fact. If you only know a little bit about orcs, and you hear everyone say that purple paint makes a green skin invisible, what reason would you have to think otherwise? But in truth, orc powers are really only a lubricant for reality, not changing whole-scale laws of physics on some mass scale. In fact, the Imperium's lasguns being recharged by open flames is more extreme and comical than some of the orc powers, if we're just putting it into perspective. And yes, that's a real fact about lasguns, and no, it doesn't make any sense. But with orcs, it's less so that what they believe equals truth, and more so just that if things are 80% of the way there, their mental aura covers the last 20%. Imperium Magi don't understand orc tech not because there's no possible way for it to function, but simply that it shouldn't. When you have something, say, like an orc blasta, it's not just an L-shaped piece of metal that happens to fire bullets. No, there's a trigger, a bolt, a barrel, a magazine, some sights, and all the ordinary parts you'd expect to find on a gun. The key detail in orcs, though, is that the magazine will be too large to fit into the magwell, the sights will be totally off kilter, and the bolt itself will be a few feet forward of the chamber and receiver. But it works. 80% of the gun is there. All the parts you'd expect to be there are there. But the other 20%, the fine machining and measuring that goes into making a gun fire accurately and consistently without exploding, that's the part that's pretty much carried by the wumbo jumbo. Now, why is getting this right important? Most of the time, it isn't. I think with a lot of these, as we'll see, the truth isn't necessarily super prevalent, which is why a lot of these things get repeated. There's not a lot of reason to fight the ideas, the memes, and they're well liked, which, as we've seen with other stuff in Warhammer's past, is a good enough reason that one day it very well could become a part of the canon for real. But for my purposes here on YouTube, doing a little bit of light power scaling, it does become important because if we want to compare and rank crazy sci-fi concepts against each other, having clear boundaries really simplifies things. That's why I always mention the K-6 bullet, because it's a misconception among people that aren't super big into Destiny that ghosts, the things that revive Guardians, can just be popped by any old firearm. But that's explicitly not the case. And knowing that truth deepens our comparisons and makes it more gripping to get into these kinds of debates. Compared to something like the Q from All Tomorrows, these are aliens so far beyond our understanding that they're nearly gods, just a step down from Lovecraftian horror. All we get about them is that they use nanomachines to change genetic code, and they fought a species that used supernovas as if they were ordinary weapons. Even as impressive as it sounds, that's not really a lot to go on, which means for most of the comparisons we make to them, it's mostly vague conclusions drawn together by a handful of lines, not the most succinct way to come to a reasonable end. So for the things on my channel and others like it, it is important in a way, but for the most part, the way Warhammer on the tabletop is supposed to be, if you want your orc army to be painted yellow because it makes them fire bigger bombs, or if you choose to fit them into Astartes armor because it's a clan that believes themselves to be Humies, go right ahead. The universe of Warhammer is very pliable, and really the logistics and rules of it change drastically depending on the medium you're in, which brings us to the next point. Now, if I asked you the strength of an Astartes, what would you say? Above average for humans? Or on par with superheroes like Spider-Man? Because depending on the source or the specific instance, this is another one that jumps all over the place. We see Space Marines run through cars. We see them struggle against bugs that are smaller than them. We see some break their own limbs trying to lift tanks, and other sources that say they can lift upwards of 20,000 pounds. When I say it changes based on the medium, this is what I mean. In a game like Space Marine, the Astartes might jog at a brisk 5 miles an hour. But in other mediums, they can be portrayed up to 50 or even past cheetah speeds at 70 plus miles an hour. In the books, they can be described as having nanosecond reflexes, while in official animations, they get blindsided by regular humans, and even in other books, get beaten to death by farmers with wooden tools. And this goes doubly so for named characters, and especially Primarchs, who supposedly move faster than light in some cases, but are only ever depicted at a brisk pace. Now, there's two main reasons for that. The first being that these are walking tanks, and the idea of a 12-foot tank man moving at Mach 10 on foot is absolutely ridiculous, and while it works for a novel about sci-fi demigods battling amongst the stars, it doesn't translate into action super well, at least in a way that wouldn't look goofy to us on screen. The second, being the most cited excuse, is that the written works of Warhammer are in-universe retellings of the events being told to us. They're ran through a litany of biased authors and legislators who pump the feats of their own gods and downplay every attempt of an enemy to defeat them. Now, this is something that's less so a misconception and more just inconsistency in the universe, and where that famous "nothing is true, everything is canon" line comes into play. In regards to what's true and what isn't, well, it really does depend on the viewer. Each individual spectator can come to a conclusion on what they consider to be an exaggeration versus a cold fact. Because, like with the rest of the hobby, it's really supposed to be more of a mold, a wall of clay for you to shape, rather than a brick wall that was set up decades ago never to be touched again. For me, I fall on the line of believing in-action examples to be the more accurate speed of everything, with Astartes in games like Space Marine 2 being more believable, and as they're more humanized, more enjoyable as characters than seeing them exclusively as transhuman monsters. But I'm also on the grim hope side of things. It's why I like Age of Sigmar as much as I do 40k, so I understand why some people prefer to gravitate to the totally inhuman lens as well. Next misconception is going to be tied into the Necrons, but really means a lot more to the context of Warhammer 40k as a whole. See, there's this thing that I find in a lot of comment sections where people talk about the Necron dynasties as if they just finished the war in heaven, the great stars as ammunition against the gods war in M42, or modern 40k. Or, in short, the Necrons are talked about as if they are a total, unified force that's capable of putting away gods on a whim, no matter how complex or strong they may be. And I'm not going to say that the Necrons aren't strong. Obviously they have to be to justify being such a relatively small faction in the 40k setting. Not that they're literally small, but just not very present in the galactic landscape. That's just not the case. In almost every facet of Necron superiority, there's a catch. Are they incredibly numerous? Yes, but 99% of them are asleep or died in between the time that they went to bed and the present day. Is their technology strong enough to win wars overnight? Yes, but the lords and monarchs of the dynasties are more interested in having dick measuring contests with each other or fighting over 1,000-year-old artifacts in order to divert their attention to the bigger picture. This is part of the reason why the Silent King returning to try and rally the Necrons against the Tyranids is so important. If it wasn't a worry to them, there wouldn't be any stakes. And if a foe as mortal, even if uncountably large as the Tyranids, is an existential threat to their existence, plenty of others could be too. There's also the case of overpowered tech like the Array, but I've talked about that in almost every other 40k video, so I'll skip it here. But the main point is that context matters. Even still, it only matters at certain times. Is it wrong to think of the Necrons as a monolith? Not necessarily. Warhammer is famously light on lore for the aliens, and the Necrons only really got anything to go off of in the last decade, and what they have gotten is very sparse, at least when you compare it to things like humanity and Space Marines. But for my purposes here on YouTube, power scaling and the like, these details do matter a lot when building a narrative and taking the state of modern 40k into account. Which brings us to the next big misconception. Now, this is one that I covered in episode 3 of the Doctor Who series, so instead of just rehashing it, I'm just going to copy and paste the script. The Ordo Chronos of Warhammer 40k, a small branch of the Inquisition intent on discovering and dealing with chronological time anomalies within and around the Imperium. Now, this is a great example of 40k using 1 or 2 lines for flavor, and the community expanding that to places unseen. I've seen everything about them in my comments, from they remove themselves from the timeline when not in service so chaos cannot corrupt them and have access to their tech, or that their operations are paradoxes in of themselves and that's what removes them from existence, to the claims that the Ordo Chronos could easily just deal with threats like the Doctor Who's Weeping Angels, Daleks, and even the Doctor themselves, because undefined time travel stuff and Warhammer always wins. Now, not only is there a lack of any substantive source to back all this up besides popular fan theories or headcanons, in all my research I couldn't find a singular primary source that says they remove themselves or have time travel tech so advanced that Chaos or Necrons couldn't get a hold of it for fear of something greater. Like a lot of obscure Warhammer lore, the Ordo Chronos is an interesting idea that has not really any concrete answers, so a lot of sources simply state the possibilities. Maybe they did this, maybe they vanished, maybe they were in hiding, but there's no proof or substantive detail for this. Just a footnote taken too literally by eager fans. So while I'm sure the Ordo Chronos we do know about would be taking records of things like the Weeping Angels and other time travel things such as the temporal distortion caused by warp travel into account, there's nothing I could find that says they'd have the powers to actually do something along the lines of manipulating time itself. Like, not to spit some heresy, but if the Imperium had some time travel tech on the level of Doctor Who, why wouldn't they mount a mission to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal, besides the latent irrationality that plagues the Imperium on a regular basis? Again, I'm gonna have to chalk up the Ordo Chronos to the fate they've found in many of GW's work, a footnote that sounds interesting but is not explicitly given to us in any form that would indicate substantive argument for my purposes here on YouTube. And this really is just another example along the lines of the Orc belief system. A few lines of flavor text fluffed up by the community, and then these substantiated claims become de facto proof of something more concrete, which never even existed in the first place. Now, if you haven't noticed a particular theme in this video thus far, here's the final point I have for you. The greatest misconception I see from people, particularly newcomers to the hobby, or just fans who are more invested in the lore and not the creative side of the hobby, is the fact that it is not concrete. Now, I'm not saying nothing matters or that there aren't guidelines, but they only really matter so much as it pertains to the board game and models. In the last 20 years, Warhammer has really tried to properly define itself between books, games, and new lore that gets written, rewritten, and added on. The universe has taken itself a lot more seriously as a setting than it used to in the early days. Back in old school Warhammer, during the very first editions, you could have elven space marines or female marines and no one would blink an eye, because there just wasn't anything to say otherwise. Now, while it's much more defined in the modern day, I think people who treat the lore and universe of Warhammer as this unmoving, solid brick foundation that you're merely supposed to lay paint on are missing the point of the hobby, of the creation. And it is a two-sided sword, because on one hand, letting things get a bit looser means that there isn't a solid, concrete story to follow or be invested in. Who cares about these Necron stories if they get rewritten every 5 years? Who cares about Titus if he isn't treated with the same canon authority as a Primarch or the Emperor? Although, I'd say that mindset is mostly born of the setting taking itself too seriously to begin with in the culture of the internet, meaning that a lot of people wrap their identities around the universe, so any change to it is a threat to their own identity. which I understand can be hurtful, but I also don't think it's very healthy if such a change in a fictional story is that foundational to your own personal life, because changes to a universe like this don't erase what used to be, what it meant and will continue to mean for you. But in the end, I prefer to approach a series like Warhammer like you would Dungeons and Dragons. Now, it's a lot more refined and direct than D&D is, with set rules on the tabletop and a much more stringent set of ideas around each faction, but getting too literal when it comes to the expanded universe takes away from the core of the series, the board game and the armies that you create. I was kind of thinking of and reminded of this scope in a video by Midwinter Minis, a hobby guy on YouTube who went into why he's moved away from 40k en masse with its duct-taped rule set and clogged repetition into the Necromunda system, which is a lot more fluid, narrative-focused, and gives more attention to the small-scale stories you can tell with the models and gangs you create.
The tabletop game has to be vaguely balanced and simplified to be actually playable and moderately fun. Move 6 inches, hit on 3s, wound on 4s. You have to keep it simple to keep the game flowing. 40k is designed for chucking buckets of dice around and sweeping whole squads off the board, not for simulating one warrior dismantling an army with surgical skill.
Not the best for selling thousands of dollars of plastic crack, but very fitting for what the heart of 40k used to be, and what it really should be. And this is what I really meant earlier by the medium changes the setting. Because depending on how you interact with 40k will drastically change the outcomes that you will see. And for me personally, I see it as a creative hobby that invites fan-created stories to flourish inside a set universe. Less directly like D&D and more like any other TTRPG system in an established world like Star Wars or Cyberpunk or Fallout or what have you. If you're all in on the books and the lore exclusively, you'll find the lore to be more important. To me, it just isn't. I like the lore in a way that it lays the foundation for my Salamander successor chapter to have a backstory that fits into the established universe, so that when I paint them and play them on the tabletop, it feels like I can be a part of that greater narrative. A kind of creative challenge to make something new while following the loose guidelines. And the freedom of going as far as inventing space-made Astartes to making a band of Chaos Marines that are mutated to be more of werewolves rather than covered in the traditional tentacles, that bandwidth and spectrum you get with the hobby is what I value the most. That creative expression that flourishes in these spaces. The great misconception here is that there isn't one version of Warhammer 40k. It's not a brick wall with a series of paint coats. It's a clay wall that can be molded and shaped by every single person who steps up to it. It changes. It looks different depending on who stands in front of the wall, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's what will make it special. Each hand adding a little detail onto the wall as it grows and grows in size. Because the rest of the building the wall is attached to will be there pretty much forever, but the wall you interact with is what changes year to year. The slices you interact with in video games or books are not rigid walls that you can't move around, but simply the clay as informed by another creative mind, by another creative team. Titus moving at a max speed of 5 miles per hour doesn't mean that Marines can't be superhumanly fast, but merely that the creators for that version of the wall, whether it's an issue of realism or game balance, molded it in that way. And in the end, what matters is exactly what matters to you. But you need to keep your mind open. You need to keep it creative, because that's the best way to enjoy Warhammer and give you the most out of what it was always meant to be. But that'll be it for today. As always, I want to give a giant thank you to all my members and patrons who you can join for just $1 a month to get your name up here on screen, or like your least favorite white dad, get your name read aloud in the higher tiers, get videos early, and a few other behind the scenes extras. If you want even more, be sure to check here on the screen or check out the channel to find more meta Warhammer commentary, deep dives, other fun gaming stuff, and even some nerdy crossover examinations like Warhammer 40k versus almost anything. As always, stay cool, have fun, and be awesome. Buster out.